Hi everyone. So this is the second video for Unit 1, and for this video we're going to talk about Dogen Zenji and Zen Buddhism. One thing to say right off the bat, just as a bit of sort of like cultural context, the way that Japanese surnames work is that they're in the front, right? So we're calling this philosopher Dogen, in the way that we would use other philosophers' surnames, typically. Um, so that's something important to keep in mind. And essentially what we're going to try to do for this part of the unit is to try to think about Buddhist philosophers as a sort of exemplar of philosophical activity in the same way that we are trying to think about sort of Socrates as an exemplar of like what a philosopher is and what a philosopher is meant to do, right? We have, we're going to be primarily sort of investigating these questions as they emerge in a sort of Western context, right? Um, a lot of Greek philosophy in the Mediterranean is primarily sort of taken up sort of in European context, and we're going to be discussing a good amount of European philosophy. So it's good that we take a moment and pause and realize that that sort of introduction to philosophy is necessarily limited, as anything, that we will be able to do in 4 weeks is going to be a little bit limited. But to really tackle very seriously, a totally different Eastern tradition in philosophy, and to put it in dialogue with what we're doing by asking the same sorts of questions of it as we would typically ask of, say, the Plato that we're reading or whatever else, right? And I think that I've been able to select some very compact, very short, but very intensely interesting and representative little readings from Dogen that I think can really give you a handle on some Zen beliefs about, say, birth and death and suffering and what it means to live a good life, right? What is the point of philosophical inquiry, right? In these ways, I think that Dogen is really asking the same sorts of philosophical questions that were being asked by Socrates. And we're going to see that, this might not just simply be a historical coincidence. So I'm going to try to be good about reading out everything that's written down so that people are not potentially limited by my bad handwriting, right? So up here, Dogen Zenji and Zen Buddhism, right? So that's what we're primarily going to be discussing for this video. Now, for some historical context, Buddhism begins around 500 BC in India from the teachings of the Buddha, travels through China, and eventually reaches Japan, right? So Dogen is a Japanese philosopher. He is seen as contributing to a Japanese form of Zen Buddhism, right? And it does happen a little bit later than, the text that we are, discussing with Socrates, right? Dogen wrote around 1200, I believe. And so Dogen is actually closer to us, right, than he was to Socrates. But the historical Buddha was actually very, almost contemporaneous with a lot of this sort of philosophical activity that's going on in Greece, right? And there were lines of trade going from, India to the Mediterranean, right? And so I think that what this allows us to see is that there probably was some exchange of ideas, right, across the sort of cultural exchange, although we can't really know what exactly happened, right? So there is probably a connection between the Buddhist tradition of philosophy and the ancient Greek tradition that we're looking at whenever we're reading Plato, right, and talking about Socrates. But Dogen himself is much later, right? And if you look at sort of the tradition of Buddhist texts, there's like an extremely long and rich history. I know very little of it personally, but luckily we do have a number of specialists in our department who specialize in Buddhist philosophy, Indian philosophy, right? So if you want to know more about that, I highly recommend continuing to take philosophy classes and considering taking a class with them. And that's also to say, like I mentioned, I'm not an expert in any way in Eastern philosophy. This is my best understanding, and with that, I am certain that I am butchering the pronunciation of a lot of it, but that's okay, because we can still engage with the ideas. So, Zen begins in a tradition in China and becomes, sort of exported in some ways to Japan. Like, I believe that Dogen himself went to go study with the Zen masters in China, and he references Zen masters that he was able to learn from. That's sort of how the cultural exchange happens, but then Japanese Buddhism comes to take on very specific kind of form, right? And you can see this in sort of a split between two different kinds of schools of Zen Buddhism. We're going to get more into the details as we discuss some of the quotations from the reading. But just to give you a sense for kind of like what Buddhism is and what sort of characterizes its fundamental belief sets, traditionally, Buddhism is depicted as a way of dealing with suffering, right? It begins with this sort of, I think, indubitable claim that says that life is characterized by an immense amount of gratuitous suffering, right? We suffer immensely for certain attachments that we have in the world, like expectations about what we think is going to happen in the future. We become very disappointed with them, right? And it's easy to lose faith in the importance or the value of continuing to live, right? This is sort of the existential problem that a lot of Buddhist philosophy faces. And the central strategy that I think underlies a number of different Buddhist approaches is to diagnose gratuitous suffering as being primarily caused by unnecessary or delusional kinds of attachments, right? And I think that like one way you might characterize Buddhist belief of this sort is you might say something like, well, if you sort of are more traditionally Christian, monotheistic, say, for example, and something goes wrong in your life, you're potentially liable to interpret it as a kind of like divine punishment or something like that, right? That the world is set up right and you're suffering and you deserve to suffer, right? And the knowledge that you deserve to suffer produces excess suffering, gratuitous suffering, right? Or if you, say, like, go and try to change the world and realize that it's not really possible, right? Or you can't change things to the extent that you would like to change them, right? Well, the Buddhist diagnosis a lot of the times I think would be that you are in some ways too attached to the vicissitudes of this world, right? And you're operating under the mistaken belief that you have the capacity to change it in a really fundamental or significant way, right? And so Buddhism often portrays itself as a way of reducing or eliminating gratuitous suffering by reducing our attachments, right, to certain ideals, to certain aspects of the physical world, perhaps, right, and claiming that we can reach enlightenment, right, which not only signifies like having a kind of like being really smart or something like that, right? Like having a certain kind of knowledge. No, enlightenment in Buddhist tradition means that you've given up on these kind of attachments, right? That characterize, in their view, gratuitous, unnecessary suffering. And so we're going to see as we read Dogen together that much of what Dogen is up to is a way of leading his followers to enlightenment, but to do so in a way that thwarts the constant tendency on our part to sort of misinterpret what he's saying, right? We're going to see sort of the fundamental problem in a little bit. But essentially what Dogen has to say is that to reach enlightenment is not to have like an extensive knowledge of Buddhist beliefs or something like that, right? Like becoming a disciple at a temple and knowing more about the history and reception of Buddhism does not lead to enlightenment, right? And this is related to this division that I brought up that I haven't discussed earlier. Essentially, this division is about the nature of enlightenment. What does it mean to give up these kind of false attachments, right? And what is the right method for letting go of these attachments, right? And so there's two different lines of thought. There's the Rinzai school and the Soto school. Dogen sort of helped found or helped establish the Soto school in part, I believe. So what characterizes them as different, you'll see I wrote Rinzai here and Soto here, and then I wrote a little bit in black underneath, is that I would characterize the Rinzai school as more theoretical, and they're more focused on this device called the Koan as a way of bringing students to enlightenment. So what is a koan? A koan is kind of like a riddle or a saying, right? So like the end of the actualizing the fundamental point, which describes a Zen master and a student engaging in conversation with one another and sort of getting wrapped up in these paradoxes, right? That's kind of like more traditionally what a koan is, right? And the idea is that whenever you deal with these kind of paradoxical sayings or aphorisms or something like that, that you come to realize that you didn't really have an adequate understanding that you thought you did, right? Like in the one that we sort of read in Actualizing the Fundamental Point, right? The student sort of brings up to the master, like, oh, you know, how are your actions sort of consistent with your Buddhist beliefs, right? Because if there's Buddha Dharma everywhere, why would you need to go through the trouble of fanning yourself? Like, why aren't you already sort of in enlightenment, right? And so that sort of characterizes these more theoretical koans, is that it produces this attachment by leaving you in puzzlement, right, about your own beliefs, right? In contrast, the Soto school is more practically oriented, and sort of the general method for how to reach enlightenment in this school is Zazen, which is a kind of meditative activity, right? The idea is that you're supposed to meditate in such a way that you are no longer thinking at all, that there are no objects of awareness, right? And because there are no objects of awareness, you reach a kind of pure awareness, right? That's sort of the idea underlining the Soto school. So I characterize the Soto school as more practical, right? Because what leads you to enlightenment is not like puzzling over the meaning of these koans or something like that, right? It's returning. It's returning to your pre-reflective self, right? If the attachments are founded fundamentally in illusion, then a return from illusion cannot be a more theoretical attitude, right? A return from illusion has to bring you back to yourself, right? Back to your pre-reflective, pre-theoretical sort of beliefs in what, the world is really like, right? Okay, so before we get into some quotes, let me just give you some additional terminology that I think will be helpful as you tackle the pieces, right? First of all, Buddha Dharma is sort of a catch-all word that means something like fundamental reality, right? And what you should understand by that is like, this is what reality would be like if we were not under any sort of illusion, right? So, whenever a lot of these Buddhist texts are about understanding Buddha Dharma, it's about what would it mean to understand fundamental reality in a way that is not beset by these kind of illusions, right? How can we know the truth in a real and sort of ultimate way, right? Okay, and then Nirvana is enlightenment, which is releasement from illusion and false attachment, right? So knowing the nature of ultimate reality and being enlightened, right, are very intimately connected with one another, right? So let's get into some quotations, because I think that getting into the meat of what Dogen has to say will help us understand him. So here's a quote. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. So what is Dogen saying there? Well, what Dogen is saying is that what it means to be like Buddha, right, is to know reality for what it is. It's to no longer be deluded, right? It's to no longer have false attachments. But that sentient beings who see things and understand things and try to know the world, right, they are greatly deluded. Okay. So you have this idea now that what it means to become a Buddha is to have a realization of delusion, right? But that this is very difficult for sentient beings to do, right? Okay, so let's go to the next quote so that we can kind of get more content and see how these ideas sort of fit together, right? Next quote. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice they are Buddhas. However, they are actualized Buddhas, right? And a few things to notice about this quote, right? This quote comes from the first piece that you read, actualizing the fundamental point. And what that title makes very clear is that the concept of actualization is very important here for Dogen, right? And what Dogen is saying is, so let's break it down. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, right? So what he's saying is, enlightened beings, when they are their most enlightened, right? That's how we should understand this clause. So when Buddhas are truly Buddhas, whenever they exhibit their fundamental Buddha nature, they do not necessarily notice that they are Buddhas, right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that to be a Buddha, even to be truly a Buddha, is not to know fundamental reality in the sense of having like reflective, conscious beliefs about it, right? It's not like studying a doctrine or something like that, right? Dogen's writings are very hard for Westerners to understand, in part because Dogen has chapters that are like how to wash dishes, right? And things like this. Things that Western philosophers would never really write about, and especially never put in their sort of like main central text, right? And for this, I'm referring to the Shobo Genzo, which is where the chapters that we got are from, right? These are sort of Dogen's instructions to other Zen priests and priestesses or whatever, right, at the temple, sort of about how to reach Nirvana, right? How to become enlightened, how to become actualized and help other people reach enlightenment. And Dogen is rejecting the idea that to be a Buddha is to give a doctrine, right? Like, especially in the Christian tradition in the West, it's easy to think very doctrinally, right? Right? So, like, if you want to distinguish between Catholicism and Protestantism, right, you point to doctrinal beliefs that are different, right? Communion and so on, right? You say, hey, look, they have fundamental different beliefs about the nature of God, and that's what makes you go to this church instead of this church, right? It's belief. Doctrine. That's what's important, and that's what sort of consolidates the church's authority, right? But Buddhism is fundamentally not oriented in that direction, right? It's fundamentally not about giving the correct picture of reality and then like handing that off to other people, and then they can have, the enlightened view of reality too. Instead, enlightenment is a kind of practice, right? And this is why it's related to how you wash the dishes and how you meditate, right? Because it's not disconnected from who you are and what you do. It is intimately tied into who you are and what you do. And when you are most prone to illusion and false attachment and deception is whenever you think about yourself in this sort of theoretical way, right? Whenever you feel disconnected from reality, right? That is the sense of illusion. The sense of illusion is that reality is somewhere else instead of where you are right now, right? So to be an actualized Buddha is to be engaged in practice, right? So like how you are in a pre-theoretical way whenever you're just having a good day and you're going through the world, right? That's the closest that you reach to enlightenment, where you feel like days or even months pass you by without the need for you to really be like, oh, I wonder where my life is going, right? This is what Dogen is trying to identify as being like the real center of the actualization of enlightenment. not just in theoretical inquiry, but in our practical attitudes, right? The way that you choose to wash a dish reflects the way that you're choosing to live your life, right? And you can be in deception about that, right? You can be in bad faith and say, no, it doesn't. I just, whatever, right? But it is, right? And that's sort of the perspective that Dogen is interested in communicating to people, right? And so this is very, very interesting, very different than most approaches in Western philosophy, which tend to associate self-conscious reflection as being the heart of philosophy, right? Instead, Dogen says this is the center of illusion and false attachment. Okay, here's a really good statement of what I was trying to say earlier, and I think failing a little bit, so I'm glad that he puts things so well. Okay, he says, when you first seek Dharma, so when you first seek the nature of ultimate reality, you imagine you are far away from its environs. At the moment when Dharma is authentically transmitted, you are immediately your original self. Okay, so what does that mean, right? First sentence, when you seek Dharma, when you seek the ultimate nature of reality, you imagine you are far away from its environs, right? And here's the way that I interpret that. I interpret that as Dogen saying that when you are first seeking enlightenment, you think about enlightenment as something hidden away in a book, right? As something like a secret that somebody tells you, right? And that's sort of like what the Koan's technique can easily imply, right? That yeah, it's a secret. It's a secret that certain wise people know, and that whenever you, I don't know, join a temple or something like that, that they are going to help you figure out, right? But for Dogen, this represents illusion, right? It's an illusion that you could ever be far away from fundamental reality. Of course you're always in fundamental reality, right? You couldn't think that real reality is somewhere other than where you are, right? That's the basic sort of insight here. At the moment when Dharma is authentically transmitted, so whenever you understand in a pre-reflective way, right? And I keep saying pre-reflective. I want to make sure that you understand what I mean. What I mean is that whenever you ride a bike, you don't need to think about it, right? You don't need to make it the explicit object of your awareness. Like, you don't need to be like, left foot down, right foot up, right foot down, right? You don't need to do that, right? You need to be looking ahead. You need to be steering. You need to be changing gears. You need to be doing all sorts of things, right? And so you can't just focus on one particular thing really narrowly, right? You have to learn how to do it, right? And learn how to do it means that you have to have a practical and not a theoretical understanding, right? Similarly with driving a car, right? Whenever you drive a car, you can't be consciously aware of everything that the car is doing all at once, right? You have to focus your attention in specific directions and take certain things for granted, right? So when Dharma is authentically transmitted, when you are engaged in practice, you are immediately your original self. And I want to highlight here immediately. In other words, not through something else. It's not through a concept. It's not through this doctrine, right? You are immediately your original self, because in practice there is no separation, right? Okay, and then this is taken from the birth and death piece that was only 2 pages long. Dogen says, there is nothing such as birth and death to be avoided. There is nothing like nirvana to be sought, right? That's really fascinating, right? And I think that the sort of paradoxical nature of that statement, right? You're trying to lead people to enlightenment, but you're saying that there's nothing like nirvana to be sought. This sort of paradoxical nature of Buddhist teachings, I think, has been a theme for a very long time. I think that there's a Buddhist saying that goes something like, when you see a Buddha on the road, you must kill the Buddha, right? And so the idea, I believe, expressed through this through this story, right, through this imperative, really, is to say that to reach true enlightenment, to know fundamental reality as it is not to take it on authority, right? You can't just be like, well, the Buddha said X, Y, and Z, right? And so that is fundamental reality, or something like that. No, that's to ignore the content of those teachings, right? What makes it true is not the fact that a Buddha said it, but the content of it, right? Which is why the attainment of your own enlightenment, right? For your own realization as a Buddha, you have to kill the Buddha that comes to you, right? You have to deny or denounce claims, theoretical claims, that others will make purely on the basis of authority, right? And rather than devote your life to avoiding things such as birth and death, right, which are not part of fundamental reality for Dogen, right, you just have to tap into the reality that you're already a part of. I don't interpret this clause, there's nothing like nirvana to be sought, as Dogen saying there is no nirvana. Instead, he's saying nirvana does not have the structure of the thing that can be sought, right? You can't find it separated somewhere else, right? You have to tap into it as your own fundamental nature, right? Okay, so what that means is that being enlightenment just means releasement, right? Releasement from false attachment. Taking away all of the artificial stuff, right? All of the beliefs that you take on for the purposes of avoiding suffering or making other people happy, or because they're convenient, right? Or because they scare you, right? Releasement from those things, right? And then you can also then be released from the idea that enlightenment is something transcendent, it's something out there, it's something that's very far away from you, right? That you're fundamentally separated from, that you need someone else's help to get back in touch with, right? No, that's just you, right? And the more that you realize that your own self included, right, is one of these ephemeral attachments, the more you will reduce and eliminate excess suffering and attain something like what the Buddhist tradition calls nirvana. So I hope that was interesting to you. I hope that it sort of makes sense out of like why Buddhist traditions are so practically oriented, and why that is particularly true of the Soto school of Zen Buddhism. This is a very different perspective on death and the good life and enlightenment than we get from someone like Socrates, or as we'll see next week, Epicurus. But I think that it's extremely interesting and can be put in very good dialogue with those figures. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you have a good week, and I'll see you next time.